So we have finished the nervous system, and it did take a long time because there's so many things in nervous system that we have to cover. So after the nervous system, we will learn about the endocrine system, which is about the hormones and how the hormones control our physiological functions. So in this class in human physiology, the next chapter after the nervous system that we're going to deal with will be the hormones or the endocrine system and its function. So hormones are basically chemical messengers that are secreted into the bloodstream, and they stimulate the cells and help them to do their normal physiological function. Like for example, the thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH that is secreted by the pituitary gland will go and stimulate the thyroid cells in the thyroid gland to produce their hormone, which is thyroxine. So hormones basically help the cells to do their normal physiological or cellular functions. So there are two types of glands that we have in our system. One's called the exocrine gland, the other one is called the endocrine glands. So most of the hormones in our body are secreted by the endocrine glands, which are ductless glands. The exocrine glands are the ones that have duct, and the endocrine glands are the ones that do not have any ducts, and they will secrete their secretions into the bloodstream, where the hormone will bind to a blood protein and will then be delivered into its target cells. So if we compare the endocrine system to the nervous system, we see that the endocrine functions are much slower, but they're longer lasting. There are wider variety of targets for the endocrine messengers, but both the system, the nervous system that you learned all this time and the endocrine system, they both have a common function, which is to maintain the cellular homeostasis. Okay? So the major endocrine organs of the body, as you can see over here, starting from the brain, we have the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, and the hypothalamus, which are present in the brain. In the neck, we have two types of endocrine glands, the thyroid glands and the parathyroid glands. In the chest, we have one endocrine gland called the thymus gland. And then in the abdomen, we have several types of endocrine glands. We have the adrenal glands or suprarenal glands, which are on the top of the kidneys. We have the pancreas. Yes, pancreas is an endocrine gland too. It is known as a mixed gland. It has both its exocrine function and endocrine function. You can learn about the exocrine function when I do the digestive system. We're going to learn about the endocrine function in this, system, in the endocrine system, which is so very important. Most of you know that the hormone insulin is secreted by the pancreas, which is so very important for maintaining our glucose homeostasis, right? So that is the pancreas, and then we have the gonads, the ovary in the females and the testis in the males, which are also endocrine organs. So these reproductive organs are capable of doing endocrine functions by secreting the hormones which are responsible for the reproductive process, which we will learn, in this chapter. Any questions? Does anybody has any questions up till now? Feel free to ask me. Okay, so let us continue with. Now, before we move on to learn more detail about this individual endocrine glands and their function, we just need to know that there are two major types of hormones. The protein hormones which are made up of amino acids, and the steroid hormones that are made up of steroids. The protein hormones, they actually are too large and they cannot enter the cell, they generally bind to specific receptors that are present on the cell. So if this is a cell and this is the receptor, the protein hormones are going to bind to the receptor, and there will be a ligand receptor complex, which will in turn activate the cellular signaling process. Okay? Cell signaling process. So we are going to learn a little bit about this later on. Whereas the steroid hormones, they do not need a receptor because fat is permeable to the membrane. So the steroid hormones will directly enter the cell. And once they enter the cell, then they're going to bind to a receptor forming steroid receptor complex, and they're going to enter the nucleus and then modulate the gene and do the effect of the hormone. So steroid hormones are much faster in action than the protein hormones because they can directly enter the cell. So most of the reproductive hormones that you learn that are from the reproductive organs like ovary and testis, they are steroid in nature. Okay, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, these are mostly steroid hormones. So I thought that I'll just give you the two basic types of hormones that are out there. There are a couple of other hormones there too, like nitric oxide can sometimes work as a hormone. There are certain amines that can work as a hormone. But the major secretions are either protein or steroids. Again, any questions before we start with the pituitary hormones? All right, so the pituitary gland is the most important endocrine gland that we have in our brain, and it is also known as the bandmaster of the endocrine wagon, or the master gland. The pituitary gland is divided into three parts: anterior pituitary, intermediate pituitary, and posterior pituitary. And each of these three different parts of the pituitary gland secretes specific hormones with specific functions. And we're going to learn about this. We're not going to learn much about the histology or about the individual cells that are producing hormones. Not into that much detail, we just don't have the time. But we're just going to learn what kind of hormones are secreted from each of this region and their functions. So the anterior pituitary, as you can see over here, that we have the pituitary gland, which has the anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. The intermediate pituitary is not very well designed over here, but it is there. And we're also going to learn that the pituitary gland has a close connection with the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a bundle of nerves, which are known as hypothalamico-hypophyseal axis, or hypothalamus pituitary nerve bundles. Okay, and the hypothalamus secretes specialized hormones that controls the function of the pituitary gland. And we will learn that later on when we learn about the functions of the hypothalamus. But let us now find out what are the hormones that are produced by the pituitary gland, and what are the hormones from the anterior pituitary, what are the hormones for the intermediate pituitary, what are the hormones that are secreted from the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary secretes the following hormones: the growth hormone, which is very important, responsible for our growth; the prolactin, which is a hormone that stimulates the breast cells to produce milk; adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, that stimulates the adrenal glands to release their secretions; thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, that stimulates the thyroid glands to secrete their secretions, that is thyroxine; the luteinizing hormones, these are the hormones that helps the ovary in maturation and hatching of the eggs, both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. The intermediate pituitary, which is not defined over here, you should know this. Please write it down. The intermediate pituitary secretes melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, which helps in stimulating the melanocytes, cells of the skin, which produces melanin that gives the skin the pigment and helps it from protection against the harmful UV rays. So that melanocyte stimulating hormone comes from the intermediate pituitary. The posterior pituitary produces two hormones, and these two hormones that are produced by the posterior pituitary actually are synthesized in the hypothalamus. They're actually stored in the posterior pituitary. So if I ask you that the name of those two hormones are oxytocin and vasopressin, or ADH. You learned about ADH in the chapter 1 when we talked about homeostasis. So ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, is a hormone that helps in maintaining the water balance of the body, right? And that is actually synthesized in the hypothalamus and is stored in the posterior pituitary by the, this hypothalamic or hypophyseal axis that I just told you, the bundle of nerves that connects the hypothalamus with the posterior pituitary. So the other hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin helps in contraction of the uterus during childbirth. And you remember that it works by positive feedback mechanism. We discussed that in chapter 1. And these two hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin, they are actually stored in the pituitary gland, in the posterior pituitary, and they are released according to the need of the body. Do you all have any questions? We have covered a lot of, areas pertaining to the endocrine system. So are there any questions? Nobody has any question? Okay, so let us continue with functions of these individual hormones. And there are two things that we need to know in the endocrine system, which is number one, what is the function of that hormone? And then what happens if that hormone is secreted more? We call that hypersecretion. Or what happens if that hormone is secreted less? In certain instances, like the growth hormone, we also need to know what happens if the hormone is secreted more before puberty, and what happens if the hormone is secreted more after puberty. Like, for example, the growth hormone, if it is secreted more before puberty, it results in gigantism. The person will be very, very tall, 7 feet tall. We call pituitary giant. Whereas if this hormone is secreted more after puberty, puberty is any range between 11 to 15 years, and after puberty, if this hormone is secreted more, hypersecretion, that gives rise to a disease called acromegaly, where instead of the person growing in height, will start increasing in girth. Okay, they have protruding jaws and protruding hands, and we're going to do those clinical, features once we come to, discussion of these hormones much more in detail. But remember that for pituitary gland, or for any gland and for any hormones, it is important to know, what happens if there is hypersecretion, or what happens if there is hyposecretion. So growth hormone, or somatotropic hormone, as it is known as, its major function is to stimulate bone growth and cellular growth. So you learned in human anatomy, when you did anatomy with me, that long bones have these growth centers, right? So the growth hormone will stimulate these growth centers. So the bones are going to grow in height, and the person is going to get taller and taller and taller, okay? Until around 21 or 22 years of age, the growth plates ossifies. They are not cartilage anymore, they become bones. And then the effect of the hormone has no effect. And so the bones are not going to increase in height anymore. Okay? So that is the function of the growth hormone. Now, I